Okay, I think we'll get started. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Melanie Kay and I direct the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative Collegiate Program at Colorado Law. And we are thrilled to have all of you join us here today. Before I dive into an introduction of Peter, I'd like to welcome my two co-hosts for the program today. And that's the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative Collegiate programs at both CU Denver's Business School and at CU Boulder's Leeds School of Business. So I'd like to let each of the directors of those programs say a brief hello and welcome to their guests. So we'll start with Ira Selkowitz at CU Denver.
Thank you very much, Melanie. On behalf of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative at the CU Denver Business School, I would like to thank Peter Anderson from Carnival for taking the time to speak with us today. We are pleased to be partnering with the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative programs at CU Law and the CU Boulder Leeds School of Business to present this important program. And we have students, faculty, and staff in attendance from the CU Denver Business School, the Anschutz Medical Campus, the School of Public Affairs, and the College of Engineering. Please enjoy the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Ira. I'd also like to invite Stephanie Johnson from the Leeds School of Business here in Boulder to say a brief hello as well.
Hello all, can you hear me? Okay, great. Yes, I think Ira said everything that I want to say. Thank you to Peter, who I had the pleasure of meeting on an earlier call this semester with the Daniels Fund, and we're just really thrilled those Leeds students who are here to benefit from this discussion on ethics in just like such an important time and such an important topic. So thank you for coming, and thank you to the Daniels Fund Ethics Program at CU Boulder, CU Denver, and across Colorado.
Thank you, Stephanie. So for those of you unfamiliar with the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative, it is a consortium of schools that receive a grant from the Daniels Fund to bring principle-based ethics education into our curriculum. And so I wanted to briefly share with you those principles, and those are going to be incorporated throughout Peter's talk today. And those principles include concepts of integrity, trust, accountability, transparency, fairness, respect, rule of law, and viability. So we are thrilled to have Peter Anderson join us today. Peter is the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at Carnival Corporation. He's a former federal prosecutor with over 20 years of experience in corporate compliance. He had previously been the head of the white collar and compliance group at the law firm of Beveridge and Diamond, and was initially engaged by Carnival Corporation to conduct a compliance program assessment. He also led the environmental compliance team on the Volkswagen monitorship over the past 2 years. In his role at Carnival, Anderson directs strategy for and drives a culture of compliance and integrity that ensures adherence to legal and statutory requirements and the highest ethical principles. He also leads the effort to develop new compliance training programs for the company's 120,000 employees around the world, and is responsible for making significant contributions to the company's compliance risk management program, including identifying potential areas of risk in operations and implementing risk management plans. After studying law at the University of Virginia, Anderson clerked for a federal district judge in Charlotte, North Carolina, before joining the honors program at the Environmental Crimes Section at the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. He later became an assistant U.S. attorney in Charlotte, and after leaving government service, his law practice involved both reactive defense and proactive compliance counseling services. He has been an adjunct professor at the Charlotte School of Law for 5 years from 2010 to 2015, teaching classes in fields including environmental law, corporate compliance, federal criminal law, and compliance risk assessments. He received his Bachelor of Science, summa cum laude, in environmental science from Rutgers University, and was previously board certified in corporate compliance through the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics, and is a frequent guest lecturer on a variety of corporate compliance issues and best practices. So we're thrilled to have him join us today to talk about Carnival's compliance journey, which, as you can imagine, has taken some unexpected twists and turns, particularly in recent months. A couple of brief housekeeping items. We would really appreciate it if you would fill out a very brief attendance survey. The link to that was just posted in the group chat. It's 2 questions. It'll take you probably 10 seconds, but it helps for our reporting obligations under our Daniels Fund grant. And there will be a 15-minute Q&A at the end of Peter's presentation. And please send me chatted questions that I will then filter and moderate and send along to Peter so that we can have an efficient and smooth running Q&A session. So without further ado, Peter, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you all so much. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here. I was hoping that it was going to be live, but we all have to be nimble and make adjustments. But again, thank you, Ira and Stephanie and Melanie for the opportunity. And I'm really looking forward to, over the next hour, just sharing my perspective on where we are and where we're going to be. And I tried to look at the topic with an eye towards lessons that could be learned more generally, not just in our industry, but across the profession in general. So let me see if I can share my screen to make sure that it pulls up. And if you guys could just confirm that you can see that, and I'll put it in presentation mode. Does that work okay? Excellent.
We can see it.
Fantastic. And again, I want to also do a shout out to the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative. I was able to attend the event a couple of weeks ago and was really impressed at the range of speakers. Again, I love the intercollegiate, inter-university, and these topics are really important because they cut across not just business, law. It's really, I love to see the interdisciplinary focus. And ironically, it's our program at Carnival Corporation is a microcosm of that. Members of our team come from a variety of backgrounds, which you'll hear about today. But I really want to thank the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative and also the principals. Ironically, when I was tasked with redesigning our program last fall, I really wish I had done better research and used a lot of the Daniels Fund principles, because you'll see that they're embedded partially, but it's a great kind of roadmap of what it really means to self-govern. What is it, how a company can approach minding its own both compliance and ethics store. And it's really critical to have that perspective. So in terms of my screen isn't advancing on the monitor. So can you guys see my second slide here with my background?
Not yet. Sometimes if you click it twice, you'll get to it.
Okay.
Sometimes it takes more than once.
Let me see. It's just advancing beyond. So yeah, I need to figure out how to see if I can go back to it. Let me see if I can share that. Nope. It doesn't seem to be registering here. Bear with me there. For some reason, I have a monitor that shows the first slide, but it's really not.
Peter, since I am Zoom teaching right now, maybe one thing is if you took it off presenter view, it might.
Let me see if I.
Oh,
you just got it to go to the next slide.
So you see me with the 3?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll just pay attention to my one monitor here because I think the other one is frozen. So my background, as Melanie indicated, I think it's always important when you have any topic on ethics and compliance. We see this field often from the lens that we come from. And as Melanie mentioned, I got into this field thinking that the way you change corporate behavior is really through criminal law. You can have some civil sanctions, you can have some administrative remedies, but in a partially naive format, I really thought that for the most serious violations, the the role that criminal law plays is really critical, and it still has an incredible role. And that's why I dove in as a former federal prosecutor to really kind of learn the ropes on how to exercise discretion in evaluating investigations where criminal sanctions were warranted as opposed to perhaps not. And unlike traditional crimes, which are more conduct-based, the white collar is more intent-based. And so when you're deciding whether to bring criminal charges and against whom, not only just individuals, executives, but also the company, I really learned the mindset of the way a prosecutor evaluated facts. But I was very frustrated because at the time, this is over 20 years ago, there was very little written and very little exchanging of the playbook from the government about how the government thinks about these things. And so oftentimes when I would interact as a prosecutor with defense counsel in the midst of investigations, it seemed like there were two ships passing in the night, that the playbooks weren't really exchanged. And so I, as a federal prosecutor on the outside, would be trying to investigate and understand a company and why decisions were made and what the deficiencies or strengths were. And then I was talking to defense counsel and executives who didn't understand my mindset. So I really wanted, when I left the government, to try to end up breaking down those barriers and silos culturally, and also to understand and exchange and help companies understand the way the way prosecutors evaluate companies. So when I left the government, my practice was really proactive and reactive. The reactive was the FBI's there with a search warrant. What do we do? And it was a scramble and it was a crisis. But I really felt over the years, aside from defending companies and executives at trial, my real passion was going further upstream in the risk paradigm to find out how can we help companies make better decisions and have a better appreciation of how to govern themselves. And so I was really expanding my proactive corporate compliance role with an eye towards helping companies get better at risk management. So, and ultimately I was doing a number of counseling engagements, and Carnival came along and asked me to help them avoid a probation revocation in basically February or March of 2019. And basically when I came on board, hold on. Okay, is it switching there then?
Yes, that worked.
All right, perfect. Okay. No, thank you so much. And again, apologize. Technology is sometimes our friend and sometimes our nemesis. So basically, when I was brought on as a consultant, unfortunately, Carnival was in the midst of the risk of having their probation revoked. And my task as a consultant was to come in and figure out where the program was, how to improve it, and make some recommendations. Why this case study is unique is, unlike some federal environmental criminal prosecutions, there were really no catastrophic impacts in this case. This wasn't a BP where you've got massive spills and you have chronic noncompliance. But the company had over 105 ships, 180,000 employees, and the ships really are floating cities where you've got wastewater, air quality, ballast water, a variety of technical and engineering complex systems. And so because of the non-compliance that had gone on, it was really just because there was an earlier prosecution and a plea in 2002, and then again in 2017, there was another kind of prosecution, both involving environmental crimes, Clean Water Act discharges, and false logbook entries. So, but some of the things, having done a number of environmental crimes on both sides, this was unique because there were no massive impacts, fish kills, but again, and there was also corporate liability without any individual co-defendant. This is more of a systemic problem and minimal financial motivation for the crime. But because the company was viewed as a recidivist, it's pretty rare when a company is prosecuted federally for crimes to have a second run-in. And that's why they had put the company originally on the first probation, and then when the second crime hit, it was a longer 5-year probation. So basically, in our industry, we were basically 105, 108 ships out of 300 ships in total across the planet. So it's a pretty large industry, and we were comprised of 9 different brands. So you kind of have a decentralized federation that had evolved. As I mentioned, the first felony plea was in 2001. Next was in 2017. And the federal government's attitude was, look, you didn't get your house in order after the first run-in, so we have to ratchet it up in terms of proportional punishment. So when you look at, a lot of people don't realize, I didn't until I came on board and got involved with Carnival, that there are 9 essentially different brands within the corporate umbrella. So on the screen, you can see we're Carnival, Holland America Line, Costa and Aida in Europe, Australia, Princess on the West Coast, Seabourn, and every one of and Cunard which is the old White Star, and all of these kind of brands at one point were competitors that were then brought together. And the brand-led model is great when you're talking about innovation and guest experience and marketing, but when it comes to other corporate functions where you want to lead from the center, that was one of the things that in my diagnosis, there was some need for changes to have oversight, governance, and consistency between all brands in the ethics and compliance, IT, procurement, health and safety, other aspects like that. So I think what people often ask, when a company has a run-in, why wouldn't they have set up systems to prevent a second run-in? And that's, that is the ultimate goal of prosecutors, is to bring about reform so that you don't have repeat violations. And I think, from my coming on as a consultant, there were some really talented people. And that's one of the reasons why I ultimately joined the company to take over as the chief ethics compliance officer and redesign the program. There was a lot of talent, there was a lot of potential, but again, there was a lack of appreciation and real internal expertise of corporate compliance as a separate discipline and industry. There was a lot of environmental, there was a lot of safety, but there wasn't linkages that were needed. And there was also kind of an incomplete understanding of what led to the prior crimes. It wasn't, a rogue employee. It was more, how can we build in systems to understand and prevent what happened, why did it happen? And again, this isn't really a rogue employee. It's really what's making employees do this. So you can't just send out new memos or new training. You really have to get to the cultural changes that we're in the midst of. Also, Carnival is an incredibly complex organization. And there was also some issues we needed to address with blame culture. People often didn't want to raise their hand, raise problems. So often, the leadership wasn't aware of some of the ongoing problems that need to be addressed. And we'll talk about that a little bit in what we did to improve. A lot of people ask, did we have at Carnival any historical compliance structure? And the answer was yes, but it seemed to be very siloed and very brand-led and not really corporate-wide. So the environmental compliance function was often led by maritime operations. And those are basically the doers. Those are people who have to maintain the ships. So there was a blend
flip the paper over to the rack. But be
so there was
careful you don't
a
slide
need
off.
to separate kind of the monitoring role from, it was almost prior, it was a self-monitoring. And you want to have some separation and objectivity when you're thinking about how to have that effective governance and objectivity in the checking. Also, the general compliance was under the legal department. So again, and it was a relatively low maturity program where it really did focus on things like hotline management, code of conduct, general compliance training. So when I came on board as a consultant, I really tried to unpack some of the significant changes we needed to make, centralize the ethics and compliance, make it ethics, not just compliance, and really focus on getting leaders, and we'll talk through what the changes we made, and have that reach throughout the corporation to get some consistency. I also recommended that we have a board member with experience in ethics and compliance to basically help other board members kind of understand this unique area. So as I mentioned, our first storm, we're going to be talking throughout this journey of 2 storms. The first storm was this 2017 plea agreement. It lasts for 5 years. It will extend until April of 2022. There's a court-appointed monitor that has a very broad mandate, not just environmental, but also culture. And again, the initial problems that the company had was they didn't understand the CAM's authority and role. So there was, unfortunately, distrust before I came on board, and we're working through building that trust back up. And it seemed to be very much like a litigation model in the monitorship instead of a cooperative consultation and improvement method. It seemed to be adversarial, and so we're working on that. At 2018, there was this risk of probation violation, and I had stepped in to try to do the assessment. And I often used I used the DOJ guidance to say, what does the company have in place? What do they need to get better? And made a variety of recommendations, all of which were adopted by the company and were made part of a settlement agreement. And then we were off to the races. Because the deadlines had to be, for implementing the initial phase of this, had to be completed by October, that's when the company had chosen or made the offer to me to come in, because having another professional climb the learning curve and implement these changes in this short time frame. So it was a great opportunity for me. I loved the law firm I was at, but I was really looking forward to getting in the chair of trying to build and strengthen a program. And I came on board as their first chief ethics and compliance officer to design, develop, and oversee and implement the improvements that we had laid out in the recommendations. So a lot of times people ask, why did you make it an ethics program as well as a compliance program? And I think you can't really identify, I think that, as many of you on the call know, the state of the art is evolving. You have to blend these 2 fields. Some can do it well by having a chief ethics officer and a chief compliance officer. I think where we were, I felt very comfortable about blending the compliance with the ethics together. Yes, we want to follow the rules, and in our space, the rules are incredibly complex. We really have 2 halves of our program. One is the HES side, which is the health, environment, safety, and security. The other is the general compliance, things that aren't unique to our industry, FCPA, antitrust, aspects that really face every corporation. And we always want to end up getting better at following the rules. And by rules, we mean laws, regulations, but equally important is company procedures. I made it very clear, and the board and the company management were adamant, we want to build a best in class. We don't want to do the bare minimum. We need to go above and beyond the bare minimum. So that's where our company procedures are often set higher and above what the law really requires. But equally important is just doing the right thing. There are many times where you can do things that the law allows, but that's not necessarily the right thing. So we want to look at outcomes, process, and in the ethics, our program looks at balancing a variety of stakeholder interests in the decision-making process, as well as always evaluating the outcome of our decisions. So one of the mantras of our team, or mottos of our ethics and compliance team, is we really view our role as doing the right things and helping the company. Every employee owns ethics and compliance. It's not something that can be outsourced. So you want to encourage everyone, we need to do the right things, we need to do them in the right ways, but also we want to do them for the right reasons. It's not just about reducing risk or reducing liability. It's a testament about who we are as individuals and who we are as a company. And that's really when you get into some of the principles in the Daniels Fund. I think it really fits in well. As Melanie kind of laid out, here are the principles that really every company that wants to figure out and use this list as a benchmark for self-awareness and evaluating where do we need to make progress. You will never be exceptional in all of these. And one of the things about compliance, it's like the US mail. It never stops being delivered, right? So you have to, if you're going to get into this field, You have to have immense patience. And there's a whole separate lecture on the skill sets you need to be an effective ethics compliance officer. And everyone approaches it differently. But one of the things is you have to be ever vigilant. We may be really strong on integrity 1 3-year period, and then we're really falling down on the rule of law factor. So all of these things are really critical. And I tried to unpack some of these principles and really apply it briefly. So when you look at integrity, we want to act with honesty in all circumstances. How does that really apply? We want to promote speaking up and reporting. We want our people to be our eyes and ears and not have any retaliation, whether it be internal logs, external reporting. We have to be, engaging in radical candor with each other. We have to be respectful, but you need to be honest, even when honesty can be painful. And that's something that a lot of companies just have to turn that corner. And building trust, I translate that into, what do you mean by trust? Is say what you do what you say, and just be upfront in making progress, in setting goals. If you miss them, evaluate why, but follow through. And most importantly, a lot of companies are great at coming up with priorities, vision, and values. But the trust element comes in, especially with credibility in your program. Are you backing it up with actions, with resources? I always said as a prosecutor, you can speak in words, but your actions are far more effective. So you're really measured by what you say. That's really important to start. What you do and what you incentivize. What are you measuring and what are you rewarding or deterring? Those 3 things, and I think the actions are more significant. It goes right to that trust and accountability principle as well. Are we really being honest about our overall performance, especially when we stumble? And how do we get back and develop a path for improvement? That is the essence of self-governance, which is really what effective compliance and ethics is. Are you minding your shop in the broadest possible way? Transparency, both internal and external, builds trust. A lot of these principles support each other. They're not standalone. So we're a big believer of needing to show your work and again, maintaining and managing internal and external communication. So you don't just say that you're committed, you demonstrate that you are committed, and people reach the conclusions on their own by your actions. Fairness, again, could not be more important. The just and fair culture. Yes, we're going to end up punishing certain people, but only when we've assumed giving them the best intentions. Let's figure out why people are engaging in violations. And again, avoid blame. Our investigations shouldn't be about pointing a finger and blaming, but look systemically about what caused these violations and how do we improve. How do we incentivize with HR performance and reviews, not just seniority or economic performance, but are you living the values that we care about? And so we're in the process now of revising our performance reviews so that if you are engaging in unethical conduct or things that don't promote our values like environmental protection, you're either going to be terminated or you're not going to be promoted, and you certainly won't have a bonus. You'll probably lose an opportunity, but you need to put your money where your mouth is. Respect, and these days, is huge. We have, and you'll see in our themes, our culture essentials, respect and protect are at the pillar of our values. So, again, respecting each other, respecting the planet, respecting the rules, diversity and inclusion, all of these things are outgrowths of these principles. So similar, when I made the transition from an outside practicing lawyer, former prosecutor, to inside the company, the biggest thing I really realized is how do you operationalize these concepts, right? The ethics and compliance theory is easy to teach. What's more difficult is how do you actually make it real and not just on the website? Like, how do you build it in and bake it in every department? And that is an ongoing process. So you'll see, again, the principle and the applications to our program. Again, these principles from the Daniels Ethics Fund are just really, they translate incredibly well. And again, in 2019, when I was brought on board, the first task was to assemble my team. There were a lot of talented people. Some were in the legal department, some were in the maritime department. We had to create at our all brands group, essentially our headquarters, who are the people that are going to be on the team? What are their backgrounds? And then we also had to say, how are we going to be organized? What's the charter? What's our strategic plan? And again, you want to be ambitious with your goals, but you got to translate the goals into the actions. And that's where I think, other than just setting it up, you've got to figure out what the path forward is with activities. So our 4 goals in our strategic plan were to align and build upon fundamental principles and really pay attention to where is our culture? Do we have the mindset of, again, self-governing? Second, we were really good at reacting to crises and responding, but we needed to build in the muscle of proactivity. How do we become more of a risk-based approach? And I'm a big believer that risk management, practical risk management, is the most difficult aspect of governance and ethics and compliance. But if you get it right, it's remarkable how it will transform your program. If you figure out what your risks are, you then know where to train more, you know where to develop clear priorities for your policies and procedures. I mean, your risk profile is your roadmap for improvement and also for maintenance. So our risk efforts really needed to be put on steroids, frankly, and get smarter and better, so we're not as reactive like many other companies. We also needed to get the people, the platform, the processes, not just at headquarters, but embedding them in throughout the organization, and really figure out ways that we as a company could listen and learn from each other better. I was amazed at the number of silos that had developed. The left hand really didn't know what the right hand was doing. So these were really our 4 strategic goals that we developed last fall. And within each goal, we had about 9 or 10 activities with deadlines and owners to bring some accountability to how we're going to end up building and making changes. So in our program, and I had a head start having done the compliance program assessment for Carnival. Our infrastructure was really substantive focus areas of environmental, health, safety, security in general. And then we also created process leaders, investigations, compliance risk, compliance training, and I think very important, compliance communications. How are you reaching the head and the hearts of the employees through messaging, both internally and frankly externally as well? So this is, hopefully not an overly complicated, but you can see the board committees. I report directly to the CEO, who's exceptionally committed, and I have a deputy. I have direct reports not only within ABG in the environmental compliance, health, safety, security, and the deputy, but I also have, if you see in the center, direct reports to the ethics and compliance officers that are based in our operating companies all around the globe. So it really is a way to make sure you figure out what your risk profile is, and then you put people and delegate the responsibilities in each of those areas. And you can see in the red bands there, there's the substance leads, and then the process leads, and then outside of ABG, you've got ECOs, which are ethics and compliance officers within each essentially brand or operating company. So this was kind of our skeleton of how we're going to have accountability. And as you know, or hopefully know, the DOJ has done a great job compared to 15 years ago in sharing its blueprint. I was a big believer, if you're going to insist on the companies being transparent to the government, I felt like it was important for the government to be transparent about how it evaluates what is an effective compliance program look like. And so the 3 basic questions, and if you haven't spent time reviewing, if you just Google DOJ compliance effective or criteria or evaluation, you'll get the June version. And it's a great read for people in the field, newcomers, as well as people who've been in for decades. But is it well designed is the first question. And this is what we spent a lot of time last fall designing our program to make sure it fits our risk profile. We wanted to have a bespoke program, not one that's kind of off the shelf. Second, the criteria is it being applied in good faith? And are you adjusting to problems and continually monitoring? And last, is it effective? Does it work in practice? So this was kind of our internal guidance of kind of where we needed to get better. This is what I used, frankly, when I did the program assessment, and it's what I've been using as we're kind of growing the program. Deeper dive into the elements. Real briefly, you need to have support from the top. If you don't, you're kind of on a fool's errand, because you need your board on board, you need your executive management, and you need the middle management to know what these criteria mean. That comes from training, but it also comes from a commitment and operationalizing these words and translating it into key actions that you need to take. One of the things we spent a lot of time on is our program, does it have the stature that it needs to really be respected and effective? And me as the CECO, the Chief Ethics Compliance Officer, what's my role? Am I sitting in on key decision-making, not just an afterthought or something that's bolted on, but really kind of at the table as the company's making key decisions that have ethics and compliance impacts? Do I have access to the board regularly? Do I have access to the CEO? Who do I report to? And again, do we have adequate resources to actually carry out the plan and implement the changes we want? Is our program risk-based? Do we have, and have we looked at our policies and procedures to make sure they're effective? Here's a checklist that I put together to really convey what it really means. When you hear the term, do you have stature and authority? Here's a second level of detail that you really want. Is the Chief Ethics Compliance Officer a senior executive, or is it really just kind of a little higher than middle management? Are you sitting on the executive leadership team? Are you involved in other compensation? Are you involved in making the company's strategic and operational decisions? Are you brought in for key decision making? So again, it's really the day-to-day examples of is the company living out its priority for ethics and compliance? Do you have direct access to the CEO or the general counsel? Sometimes there's not a perfect answer, but we felt like this link directly is really key. And again, who can override the decisions of the Chief Ethics Compliance Officer, and what's that process? The CECO has to be a member of the team. The CECO is not the CEO. Again, it's collaborative, but you need a voice at the table. So there's a number of other criteria in looking at independence, autonomy that we used to really make sure that our program was grounded in each of these criteria. In structuring, do we have resources? Is our team qualified? Is our board qualified? So it was very helpful, and we just developed this on our own using some of that criteria. We also, you also need to always have effective compliance training, your hotline. Are you building in incentives and discipline, third-party management, and then lastly, kind of the continuous improvement. So we use these elements to figure out, where do we stack up? Where do we need to get stronger? And I always emphasize to people, if you're just entering into the compliance field, the basic objectives is, are you self-governing, or do you need to have a regulator or a class action lawyer sue you to get you to do the right thing, right? You have to own your own risks. You have to know what your risks are and then own them, manage them, as if you're almost like the inspector general, right? You want to have independence and expertise, but you also want objectivity. So the more you can mind your own shop, the less risks you have that somehow externally bad things will happen that will lead to enforcement, whether it be civil, criminal, or administrative. And you also want to make sure people can see what you're doing. They're not just relying on your self-characterization of whether you have a strong program or not. So you want that self-governance and transparency to handle your risks and then response. I'm a huge proponent of what I call the 4 pillars. You want to make sure that and this is another example where of these 4 criteria, you're never going to be great at all 4. You're always going to continue to monitor and see where you need to shore up. Prevention, detection, response, correction. No matter what compliance guidance is out there, all of the efforts fall into one of these 4 pillars. And you can talk about prevention in terms of training, detection in terms of auditing, response is, how are you following up on audits, and correction, are you correcting the problem at hand, or are you looking at things more systemically? Is a problem on one ship likely to come up on all the other ships, or are you just solving the problem on that ship and putting your head on the sand? And it's similar to any other company where when you come across problems, the first question is, do we really understand the root cause of this problem? And then the second issue is, if we solve it, are we at risk that this is going to be more systemic? And that's that self-governing mindset that's absolutely critical. At this stage, if we were live, I would open it up for questions throughout, but I apologize. This virtual is a little tough. The corporate vision statement we developed, you can see, among a ton of priorities, we really, our top leadership and board were adamant that our top priorities are to operate safely, protect the environment, and be in compliance everywhere we operate. Positive and just culture, inclusion and diversity, and to be an exemplary corporate citizen. These are, I'm proud of the company and the leadership for getting behind this. If the company wasn't willing to make statements like this, we'd really be in trouble. The problem is this isn't enough, right? The key to be an effective compliance officer is taking your team and giving meaning to these words in ways that aren't just kind of feel good, what I call the Hallmark card. You got to get beyond the Hallmark card and live it. So the good news about our vision statement is it's strong. It embodies many of the Daniels Fund ethical principles. It puts us in a positive direction. The bad news is, what's the exact meaning? What do you mean when you say we want to protect the environment? You got to translate it and make it relatable to everyone throughout the company. It's way too high level. So how do you fill in the blanks, get granular, get into storytelling? As a former trial lawyer, the way you make the program real is to take those words and figure out how to give it meaning and break it down. So we also, one of the things we knew is compliance is directly tied to culture, corporate culture. As they say, Peter Drucker, a business leader, always said, I think the quote is, culture eats strategy for lunch, right? So you can talk about what you want to do, but if your culture isn't of the mindset of supporting compliance, again, it's similar to your leadership. If those two things aren't aligned, it's really an uphill battle, and it's really a fundamental deficiency. So with our culture improvements, we had 9 different core values in place. So, and they were really meaningful. Seabourn had its values, Princess had its values, Carnival Cruise Line had its values, but there was really no overarching statement, no matter what brand you worked for, no matter what your job was, shoreside or shipboard. 90% of our employees are on the ships. How do you end up blending it together? There was no corporate core values, but each of the employees really aligned and identified with their brand as opposed to our corporation. So the goal is we could either develop a corporate vision statement and realign the core values, or we basically just come up with a corporate value statement. And ultimately what we did was figure out a way, how do we unify all of these core values to support ethics and compliance? So, brand by brand, what was the overarching corporate culture glue that we could all say we had in common? And so we developed what was called the culture essentials. Again, everyone could remember easily what it is, and more importantly, what are our actions and behaviors across all brands that are going to really support ethics and compliance. And this is fairly recent. Basically, we call it the culture essentials. And for everyone, including leaders, you need to speak up. You need to respect and protect, and you need to improve. And for each of those 3 statements, they're all action oriented. We have trainings and communications about what speaking up means. How do you speak up? What does retaliation mean? And how we're not going to tolerate it, and this is what we're going to do. Respect each other, respect the planet, protect, what does that really mean? But again, after the training, when you think of this, everyone knows speak up, respect and protect and improve. And then for leaders, there's an extra layer on top of that. We need to communicate with our employees to build that openness and trust. You need to listen and learn from your investigations, from your audits, from your hotlines, from just open communication of those that you supervise at the middle management level. You just have to be a better listener and learning and improving. And then lastly, you need to empower your teams. You can't just say, do this. You have to figure out what they need to do their job. So we have an alliteration of tools and time and talent and training. Do they have the things that they need to carry out their ethics and compliance responsibilities? So this took a fair amount to get 9 brands all aligned to buy in. We weren't telling them to reject their brand core values. This was a layer that we placed on top of it. But you can identify actions and behaviors, but the key is you have to support them through repeated communications that highlights each one of these and what they mean. You have to train all levels of management. And most importantly, you've got to put your money where your mouth is. So if someone is not encouraging someone to speak up, they need to be held accountable in their performance evaluations. When someone's not respecting each other, they need to be held accountable. So the performance evaluations and the expectations have to be clear as we go through that. So the good news, again, similar to the vision statement, is this is strong and it embodies many of the principles. It puts us in a direction, but once again, we got to translate in reality kind of what that really means. The exact meaning is unclear. It's too high level, and we have to once again kind of tell stories. So this is just an example of the 2 overarching high-level statements of both the vision statement on the left of our top priorities and our culture essentials on the right. What's the practical guide for the actions and behaviors? And that's what we're kind of working on now. Protecting the environment. How do we translate that into something that's relatable? Same thing with health and safety and be in compliance everywhere we operate. So we're having a number of training sessions, communications, performance evaluations will all be reflected to support this. And the goal is, again, to give meaning to those words in a meaningful way. I like to break it into 4 areas for each of those high-level terms. One is you want to highlight it. You want to have increasing communications, the frequency, the topics, the tools. Is it kind of webinars? Is it live? Is it exchange between ship and shore? After you highlight it, you want to translate and train on it. What do they mean? Where do we do a good job? Where do we fall short? How do we incentivize and reward? And then most importantly, if you don't have a way to measure, are you moving and advancing to improving and reaching your goals? That's a huge problem. So how do we translate what we want, where we want to get, into bite-sized pieces and develop metrics to kind of measure going forward, acting on the findings. And again, every program is going to run into roadblocks and barriers. And instead of denying them, you have to figure out, maybe we need some outside help into overcoming this. But if you don't measure, if you don't set goals and break it down and hold accountability, again, you're going to end up stalling out, and it's really more of a paper program instead of one that's really real. And again, you can see evolving. The second storm, here we were in the midst of, I came on board August 12th of last year. We were heading along the path, again, getting into January, February, and suddenly the second storm hit. Aside from the compliance, it was now coronavirus and the global pandemic. Massive disruption to many companies, but ours in particular. And this is really hard for people outside of the cruise industry to understand. Cruise ships are constantly sailing. Unless they're in dry dock every 2 or 3 years for a month or 2 for repairs, they pull into port in the early morning and they are gone in the afternoon and they're operating, they're like sharks, constantly swimming, right? They're always bringing new guests on, disembarking other guests that are there. So when you shut down your global fleet of 105 ships, there's no revenue coming in. And yet we're on an ECP probation where we have to continue to make progress. So each of these ships also have massive overhead. It's not like a sailboat where you can just put up on the racks. You have to constantly have a team of people, anywhere from 50 to 100 per ship, constantly maintaining, even when these ships are basically at port. When the pandemic hit, we also had 100, I think it was 85,000 of our employees on the ships that needed to get home to their families all around the globe. India, Palestine, I mean, everywhere, the Philippines. So many of those airports were shutting down. And I think a real strong cultural commitment of living out our values is we used our ships to take the vast majority of those crew members, our team members, home to their families on our ships. It cost an immense amount of money, but it was the right thing to do. Rather than just letting people get off the ships, we literally made sure we got them home. And they will remember that. That's despite the costs, it was, I mean, one of the things that I was most proud of as the company in the repatriation is we weren't just going to let our employees find their way back, but we got them home. It took, again, massive amount of resources and time, but it was a remarkable display of a commitment. And also, always looking after the guest, crew, and safety. We had to secure financing. How do you, get across this gap, which again, we still haven't been sailing yet back in the US. We just started in Europe. How do we get our fleet into warm up, meaning like not active? Right sizing the organization in terms of layoffs and furloughs, and then while maintaining the focus on health, safety, environmental protection, and compliance during the pause. Massive challenge when you're thinking about, on the one hand, cash preservation, but on the other, we're not just going into hibernation. We have 105 ships that we have to continue to maintain and be committed to make sure that we're living out our values even when the resources are incredibly strained. So this was the new reality and crisis that we were dealing with on top of the enforcement angle. So again, we developed what's called the Pause Priorities Plan. Makes sense. Now we're in a guest operational pause. There's no guests on board. What is our goal? And we developed kind of during this period, and we never knew how long it was going to last, and we're still in the US, not back sailing yet. But we wanted to focus on environmental, investigations, culture, and training. How do we, during the pause, get stronger so that when we come back, we'll emerge even better, despite kind of the resource cuts? So again, this is what we really focused on as a team across the entire corporation. We're gonna sustain our commitment despite the challenges in these 4 areas. So basically, we also developed a culture action plan that over the next year, these are things that we're going to be doing to strengthen our corporate culture. And you guys got a preview of that culture essentials that's going to be revealed throughout our corporation for the first time on October 28th and 29th. Many of our crew, again, they're still at home. They're not back on our ships. But for those who are back and people who are working shoreside, we're going to end up increasing the awareness of what we've done and also what we're going to be doing in the months ahead. The leadership will be doing self-assessments. We'll be assessing our program. We'll be training our board and executive team on ways we're going to get better and the new DOJ guidelines. We're also going to end up taking actions to reinforce the culture essentials that I went over, looking at how are we evaluating each of from the highest level, the CEO, the brand presidents, what are they held accountable for to advance ethics and compliance? Because if you don't embed that into the evaluation, if you just make it about economic performance, that's all you'll get. And the ethics and compliance will be an afterthought, and the culture improvements, there was a phrase that Jim Comey coined when he was at DOJ, that culture is the way things are really done around here, regardless of what they teach you in training. So I really, apart from the words that you claim to care about, the way you live out your culture are through the practices that you embed. And as I said, what you say, what you do, and more importantly, it's what you measure and incentivize. So that's the way you can really, and I remember as a prosecutor, I always asked the defense lawyer, I get the fact that you're saying the right things, show me. Do more show, less tell. And I think the way the compliance profession, they need to get into that mindset of more show and less tell. Let the reviewer render their own conclusions based upon what you've done. And that's where self-governance and transparency come in. If you're confident in your program and you've built a good one, then share it. And the people on the outside should be able to see what you do, what you measure transparently, and say, that, Pete Anderson doesn't have to defend the program. The program's activity itself and the measurements do it. The biggest challenge with a lot of companies I've found is they always want good news, but remember, bad news are opportunities for you to keep improving. And so if you're not listening to bad news, you're not growing as a company. And I do often say to regulators, you've got to approach the realities of compliance in the real world and don't expect perfection. And put the right violations in the right box. There are times where criminal prosecutions are needed, but sometimes when you recognize the corporate challenges that people are facing, you can deter and encourage with a carrot as much as with a stick. So it's really kind of put into all of those factors are really critical. The other goal that I like to share in talks like this is I always say our program goal is to break through the impermeable barrier. And people say, I don't really know what that means. Imagine the leaders being at a certain level, and then the rest of the corporation, the teams, be essentially below it. And there's kind of an impermeable barrier, almost like if you're a gardener, it's like the thatch that develops on your lawn. And so positive messages like our values and vision and culture essentials, people assume that if you just say it, it trickles down and permeates the entire organization. And I'm here to tell you that that's not the case. You need to make sure you break through that layer to make sure the messages you translate into reality, you operationalize what you care about. Similarly, with bad news from the front line, people always assume that if I just report up, it'll always get through. But unfortunately, when you have an impermeable barrier, the messages of good news don't really trickle down and the bad news don't trickle up. So you have to figure out constantly, how can we break through the impermeable barrier to make sure are the commitments being made by the leaders, are they relatable to everyone throughout the company, regardless of their levels? And are we really hearing from the front lines accurate information so we can govern and make better decisions throughout the company? And that really applies regardless of, a lot of these concepts I'm trying to touch upon apply regardless of the industry. It's just a mindset as we approach the self-governance and transparency. So again, my top challenge is, just to wrap up, as a newcomer, many people thought, what are you thinking? Like going as a lawyer, I mean, I'd been on one cruise, but I never really represented cruise companies. How can you come in to a new company, new industry, new people with this challenge? But I think the asset that I brought was I could ask the dumb questions, right? As the newcomer, I had counseled dozens, if not hundreds of companies as a lawyer, but I could remember what hospitals did and remember what manufacturers did and bring a new set of eyes to an industry. Again, challenges from the court-appointed monitor and that scrutiny and that review process. The pace that we're on is far faster than normal. The 9 brands and their IT challenges, and can we get data to communicate? Tons of different priorities. I always said, out of the 50 things I want to do, I have to remind myself weekly, what are the 4 or 5 things that I need to focus on? Because you can stall out if you don't accurately prioritize. It can be really frustrating. And obviously the pandemic will always go down as the biggest challenge in our first year, but I'm really proud of the way the company responded. And again, the successes, we set up the program. We think it's designed effectively to match our risks. We established the right relationships throughout the organization. We brought in the people that had the expertise. Again, we got people to think about compliance in a new way, getting our priorities, and implemented most of the first round of key initiatives as we turn to the pause priority plan and the culture action plan. Again, I work with an amazing staff and team. We have 47 on our team throughout the organization, really selfless, incredibly dedicated, and it's great to just see the silos breaking down throughout the corporation, people talking more, working more collaboratively. And our new board member just brings a ton of expertise and has been remarkably helpful. So we are nowhere near done. We will have much more work to do, but I just wanted to kind of share from a newcomer to the industry, kind of the perspective that I brought, some of the steps that we brought to improve Carnival. Some will apply, I think, directly to other companies. Others, you just have to kind of look at your own respective history and figure out how to kind of build the tools that you need. So let me stop there because I know we've got 10 or 15 minutes of questions and see if there are any that I can address. But thank you for your patience and willingness to listen, and hopefully there's value. So.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that really fascinating look into how Carnival has navigated what you called multiple storms. And it's really impressive, the progress that you've made through that time and the aspirations and vision you bring. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. We have a couple questions that have come in already that I will filter through and share with you. And I would encourage anyone else to message me with questions that you have for Peter. Also, just another reminder to please very quickly fill out that attendance survey. As I said, it's literally just a question about your affiliation, what organization. We'd really appreciate it so that we can report back on the event. So for our first question, in terms of the 4 goals you mentioned in your strategic plan as related to environmental compliance, can you give any examples of a barrier to execution on any of those goals and how you overcome that cultural barrier or issue?
Great question. I mean, some of them were, from the environmental standpoint, we had an issue of food waste. You can imagine the running joke on Carnival Cruise Line, one of our brands, which just prides itself on the buffets, and you can gain 10 pounds in a week. The amount of food that actually gets consumed, and unfortunately the amount that gets thrown out, is remarkable. So food waste is actually a violation if you don't treat it. If you just discharge it, it puts a significant biological load on the oceans. And so we really had to install biodigesters. Again, otherwise you have to physically separate the food into things that are grindable. So when you think about lobster shells, can't go in there, corn cobs can't go in there, any bones from chickens or beef can't go in there. So literally there were workers that had to look at massive amounts of food, separate it, and you're not going to be perfect in separating that amount to be put into the grinders. So we were finding there were some regulatory concerns with what we were discharging and whether it was truly ground up enough so it could be properly treated. So we had to invest in biodigesters and get them installed. The biodigesters are essentially like human stomachs. You put the food in, it basically digests all the bones, and the hard stuff sinks to the bottom, and it liquefies all the rest, which is then environmentally permissible to discharge. So that was one thing where, how do we achieve, without just putting significant, I think it was $20 million investments into new biodigesters, because otherwise it was just labor intensive and we weren't going to end up meeting our goals of avoiding food waste violations. We also had a number of new filters we had to install, just new technology and tools, and also making sure we looked at our training and what I call clearing the underbrush. There was a lot of training that had been accumulated over the years that just wasn't effective. So we look through, figure out what our training and also what our procedures, are they understandable by everyone? So those were some of the challenges. We had to make sure that our program was well understood and that the training was effective. Those were some of the ones, and the people had the tools to make their job easier. The IT is always a challenge also in terms of keeping data on our operations and what we need to report out. So.
Thank you. It's a combination of a couple questions, and you may be, I think, in a unique position because of the enforcement action from DOJ, but perhaps for you or for companies not in those circumstances, how hard is it to convince leadership, the CEO, a board to invest in compliance resources, particularly if you're not responding to already have gotten in trouble, where you see this as the future important to do, and then resistance of, do we really need this? Do you really need that money? Do you really need these people? Right. What do you see as the way to make that argument?
I think it's a great question, and it's one that, again, everyone in the compliance space has to wrestle with. And make no mistake, and this is, you can't be a purist in that there are a number of corporate objectives and priorities that you have to recognize are going on. They're competing. Your shareholder price, if you're public traded, it's a reality. But at the end of the day, you need to have leaders who have the vision and the ability and the background to appreciate. Gone are the days in the 1980s where liability was the driver for a lot of investment. If we do this and we get sued, the calculus is, okay, how much is the prevention versus the likelihood of getting kind of sued versus the payout? Now it's all about reputation. And I think more and more company leaders are realizing, do we really want, can we afford to constantly be perceived as the laggard, not the leader? And so I really find, but the problem is my message, the gospel that you can preach in compliance, advocacy, the people who are receiving the message have to truly understand it and appreciate it and be committed to moving forward. I think we're heading in a really good direction to get away from a short-sighted 3 to 5 year scale to look more of corporate reputation 10 to 20 years. And I think the generations that are coming behind me are really viewing, that's where I want to work. Like their career choices are influenced by what do you as a corporation stand for? And that's like music to my ears, because the economic is always going to be a challenge if you only appreciate economics. And like I said, with performance evaluations, are you really only evaluating how much you contributed to the bottom line, or are you evaluating the non-quantitative, qualitative? That's how you measure whether a company truly is committed to ethics and compliance, by broadening your priorities. Make no mistake, Carnival's decision-making initially was driven by pressure from this enforcement. They were doing a lot of good things, but they weren't doing enough. I think the good news is, through this experience, everyone that I interact with among the leaders appreciates now in ways they never did what it really means to have an effective program and why it's important to put it among all the other priorities. That was what the huge victory for us as a program is, to have the board and leadership say the top priorities of our corporation are environmental protection, safety, and compliance. So we're not saying it's the only priorities, but we now have the responsibility as a program to give meaning to that priority. So that's what I said. If the companies aren't willing to put their money there, I'm saying even put their mouth there, you're really in deep trouble. But even when they do put their mouth, you got to put the money to match it. So, but it is always a constant challenge. I think it's a question of the overall commitment of your leaders. If your board isn't on board, and if your leaders think this is an afterthought, I frankly wouldn't take the job, because you're always going to be banging your head, and you're just going to be a cost center instead of a reputation enhancer. So, and I think there are statistics. I wish I had more of a quant brain, but I think there are statistics that companies that are more ethically oriented and compliant are more profitable. But I think people give that, and I don't want to have to fall into that quantitative calculus because it's really value based. But I think there's a variety of ways you can get there without having a gun against your head, right? With like a threat of sanctions. But unfortunately, DOJ is right sometimes that you need to kind of put the company in a position where the reform has to be forced upon them. My challenge is to make sure the changes we're making are 30 to 50 years, not to get us through probation. We really want a permanent, we don't want a rehashing of things that are going to happen the way they did in the first round. So.
Thank you. I know you have a hard stop too, but for a 30-second answer, we have a law student wondering, as a law student, how could I get my feet into the compliance field?
Great question, and I think it's as varied as the personalities of people going to law school. I mean, my path is very different than others. Some people go through the business angle and they do corporate mergers and acquisitions and then back into compliance. Others go through the prosecution and enforcement. I think, anywhere you can get an opportunity, and I always tell my kids who are college age and look for opportunities that you're really passionate in the field. You can get a great mentor and you can get great experience and real experience. Don't worry about the money. The problem is with the law school debt, that can be an inhibitor. But I think you can really look at all the areas I touched upon. You can do a substantive deep dive into environmental and get really good on that. Or as law, you can do FCPA and get into it there. But this compliance field is exploding like I've never seen it in terms of people wanting not just to hire consultants and lawyers. They need somebody like my path who has the experience to come in and be part of their team. But there's no one right way. You just have to figure out, look internally first, then externally, and the skill sets that you love. What are the things that you like to do? Do you like trial work or do you like regulatory counseling? And really figure out, because you don't want to go with something that's profitable, but it involves skills that you hate. So I always tell people, look internally first and then match your internal skills and passion for the needs. And there are innumerable ways to get in. And again, sometimes it's through enforcement with a government agency. Sometimes it's with a law firm. But again, just keep focusing and revisiting. I made changes every 5 to 7 years in my career. And many people I know went to one firm and they've never left. So tons of options, but it's a great time to be in the ethics and compliance space because I think the sky is the limit. So.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. We're so grateful that you took the time to be with us today and give us a bit of your story and the story of Carnival. So thank you again, and thanks to everyone for joining, and take care.
Yep, thanks for all you do. Take care.
Thank you very much.